Hebrews 1:8 debunked in under a minute.
I don't think he's going to do it, but let's see.
Trinitarians tell you that the Father says to the Son, "Your throne, O God," therefore Jesus is God.
Well, it's not Trinitarians say, it's just what Hebrews 1:8 says. Of the Son, he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever."
What they don't know is that God in both Greek and Hebrew just means a deity. It's not always the supreme deity, like we have capital G God. It's also for lesser beings like angels and exalted humans. Blue Letter Bible says it can refer to the true God. It can refer to a God. It can refer to false gods. And this word can also just mean humans. Even Jesus in John chapter 10 uses the word for God in Greek for human beings. So context must determine the meaning of theos.
Yeah, I completely agree. The Greek term theos is pretty diversely used, and we use it the same way in English when we say God. We can mean God in the proper sense, the omnipotent creator of everything. We can mean God as a category of being, saying like Jesus is God according to his being, his nature. We can say that there are many gods, as in many false gods, where we are saying that they're of this spiritually powerful category, but they're not God proper. Or we can just say God as in the abstract concept of monotheism. And so, yeah, we understand that God is a varied term. It has varied meaning. And absolutely, context is key. Context is going to be very key to understanding Hebrews 1:8.
And Hebrews 1:8 is a doxology, which means an expression of praise. This is a quotation of Psalm 45, which was addressed to the king of Israel. That's also why I can say, therefore, God, your God, because that God is a king. Okay, that's not Yahweh. Yahweh is essentially the highest being and can't have a God.
Well, first off, Psalm 45 doesn't really give us enough for us to determine whether it's talking about a human king or talking about Yahweh, who is the king of Israel. If it's talking about Yahweh, who's the king of Israel, that actually makes Hebrews 1:8 even stronger. Now, even if we grant that Psalm 45 is talking about a human king and calling him God, which seems in Jewish culture would be idolatrous. I'm not familiar of any other places in the Old Testament where a human is explicitly called God with that term. Abraham is called Lord in the human sense by his wife, but I'm not familiar with anyone in the Old Testament being called God, except Psalm 82. That's a different story. But let's grant the interpretation that Psalm 45 is about a human king and it's being applied to Jesus. Well, the context of Hebrews 1 would actually challenge that interpretation. The context of Hebrews 1 is actually what leads me to think that Hebrews 1:8 is calling Jesus God proper. And it starts in verse 3. It's saying that in verse 3, Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his nature, who upholds all things by the word of his power. No mere creature, no mere man could be called the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of God's nature. The closest thing we have to this is Moses, whose face shone with the glory of God, reflecting the glory of God. But that is not a commentary on the person of Moses, who is the glory of God, whereas Jesus is being said his person is the glory of God and the exact representation of his nature. And the reason that he can be the radiance of God's glory and the representation of his nature is because Jesus is truly God. He is God in the flesh. He upholds all things by the word of his power. That is amazing, that Jesus Christ, the Son, is the one who upholds all creation. Again, no creature could do this. And if a creature was doing this, it'd be self-contradictory. Because how does a creature uphold himself as a part of creation? It wouldn't work. Jesus would have to be God for this to happen. Then we get down to verse 6, where the author of Hebrews makes a quote about Jesus, where it says, "Let all the angels of God worship him." Who are the angels of God supposed to worship? God. So if the angels of God are worshiping Jesus, as we see in the book of Revelation, for instance, then it would seem that Jesus is God. And in fact, we have a clue from John chapter 12 where John says that Isaiah saw Jesus' glory, referencing Isaiah chapter 6 where the angels are worshiping Yahweh. A little aside there. But first off, we have Jesus being called the exact representation of God's nature. Then we have Jesus being worshipped by the angels of God. Then in verse 8, we have Jesus being called God. Again, if we track the context, God proper is what is in view. God proper as in the omnipotent, eternal creator of everything. That's what Jesus is being called here. And then in verse 10, we see this even more fleshed out, where Jesus is called Lord, who in the beginning founded the earth, and the heavens are the works of your hands. This is a passage that's talking about Yahweh. Yahweh, the omnipotent creator of everything, it's being ascribed to Jesus. So very clearly, Jesus is being called God proper, as in Yahweh, the creator of everything. And this passage is very, very clearly Trinitarian, because we have Jesus, who is distinct from the Father, being called God and being ascribed the position and the being of creator. He created everything. He is in charge of everything. He upholds everything. He is the exact imprint of the nature of God because he is truly God. So no, we did not debunk Hebrews 1:8. And in fact, a broader examination of the context, which he so adamantly championed, disproves his position. He should repent and believe the good news.